Amen, church? For whatever reason, God chose people like you and me to go out into the world and share the good news. We don't have to know everything. We don't have to be perfect. We don't have to understand everything. We just have to be willing to go. So, Father, send us out to a world that is hurting to share your good news with. Amen, church? Let's sing this out. Jesus, Lord of my salvation, Savior of the world, send me out to the world to make you known. Jesus, King of every nation, this world's only hope, send me out to the world to make you known. Send me out to the world. Come on, let's say it. I want to be your hands and feet. I want to be your voice every time I speak. I want to run to the ones in need in the name of Jesus. I want to give my life away all for your kingdom's sake. Shine a light in the darkest place in the name of Jesus. In the name of Jesus. All right, now you know, let's sing it. Near to the brokenhearted, mercy you have shown. Send me out to the world to make you known. To the ones in need of rescue, lead me, I will go. Send me out to the world to make you known. Send me out to the world. I want to be your hands and feet. I want to be your voice every time I speak. I want to run to the ones in need in the name of Jesus. I want to give my life away all for your kingdom's sake. Shine the light in the darkest place in the name of Jesus. In the name of Jesus. In your name, Lord. Sing it out. Here am I will go. Send me out, make you known. There is hope for every soul. Send me out, send me out. Here am I will go. Send me out to make you known. There is hope for every soul. Send me out. Come on. I want to be your hands and feet. I want to be your voice every time I speak. I want to run to the ones in need in the name of Jesus. I want to give my life away all for your kingdom's sake. Shine a light in the darkest place in the name of Jesus. I want to be your hands and feet. I want to be your voice every time I speak. I want to run to the ones in need in the name of Jesus. I want to give my life away all for your kingdom's sake. Shine a light in the darkest place in the name of Jesus. In the name of Jesus. In your name we will go out into the world, Father. Thank you, Lord. Amen. The book of Hebrews talks about those who have come before to follow those examples. And I'm so thankful that we had a leader for 21 years to charge us and propel us and to push us forward. But as he said at his close, it really starts now. It's about what we're going to be about now, where we're going from here. So let's lean into the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. Let's make him the centerpiece. Let's sing it out. Your love has rescued us. Your cross delivered all our hearts from fear. Our hope is here. You came to make a way. Jesus, you came to raise the dead to life. A song will rise. Oh, great and
So in my experience, people either love the wilderness or hate the wilderness. How many of you would say that you love getting out in the woods and just disappearing for a few days and maybe there's no noise, your cell phone is gone? Man, this group's got a lot more hands up for this one. How many of you, yeah, there we go. It's a competition. There we go. How many of you get a little freaked out in the woods? Just a little creeped out. You never know what's around the next corner. You never know. I mean, I think there's elements of both of those answers in the wilderness. I think that there's something amazing about getting out in the middle of what God created and not having to deal with the day-to-day. But I think there's also an element, especially as the darkness comes in, that you can't see beyond the campfire, and it gets kind of creepy. And I think that right now, a lot of people in our world are getting a little creeped out sometimes, and they're scared of the wilderness. And I want to encourage us. We're starting this new series on the wilderness, and the reason we're doing that is Jesus did a tremendous amount of teaching in or about the wilderness. Throughout the entirety of the Old Testament, we see God using wilderness passages to bring people closer to Him. We see Jesus, when He's teaching, doing a lot of things where He's talking about things that can happen, great things that happen when we're off in the middle of nowhere. And today I have the privilege of talking about the very first of the 4 wilderness passages. And what I love about it is I get to talk about a story that's completely made up, but Jesus used it to teach a really valuable point. And it's in the context of some stuff that wasn't made up. And here's the story before we get into and define parable and do some of those things. Is the story I'm going to tell you about today comes right after Jesus has sent out 72 people out to kind of do the very first mission trip. He sent them out. They're going out. They're supposed to go town to town, and they're supposed to share about who Jesus is. Now, kids in the room, I know it's been a long summer, and you've been out of school for a while, but I want you to be fair. He sent them out by twos, so he sent 72 people out. How many groups is that? 36. Kids of all ages, 36. 36 groups of 2 headed out into the wilderness and into the cities and into the mountains and down by the water to share the truth about Jesus with the people around them. And I think that's pretty amazing. And what he did is he sent them out and gave them a task, and then they were all beginning to gather back when the story I'm going to tell you about today happens. They were coming back in from their mission. For me, that's really poignant. For those of you that don't know, I just came back from my 3rd of our youth mission trips on Friday. It's been a privilege to play a part in each one of them and to see other leaders kind of lead the way, but to be alongside them and watch our students just be on mission, and it's just been amazing. Looking forward to them bringing that mission right back home and making a difference, because that's what was happening in this passage. All of these 72 were coming back to gather where Jesus was. There's something really crazy that happened every time Jesus would gather his people together. How many of you watched Shark Week? I love Shark Week. I mean, I had to watch it all on DVR because I was gone. But Shark Week's amazing. The sharks would gather around Jesus and his disciples every time they came together. So I want you to picture this image. Okay, 72 people coming back to report to Jesus how things had gone, and then a bunch of religious leaders, or church people of the day, who I call the sharks, would come around the outside of Jesus' group to kind of trip him up. They wanted to be there when, not if in their mind, when Jesus messed up. They wanted to be there when Jesus was able to be discredited. And so I call them sharks basically because they would be around the outside, and they would sometimes dab their heads in, and they would kind of ask a question of Jesus thinking they were going to get him. You guys remember some of those stories in the Bible? 5-year-olds to 50-year-olds and 70-year-olds. Remember some of those stories where the religious leaders, the people that were supposed to know the best, were the ones that were kind of doubting Jesus the most? This is what was happening in the passage I'm about to read to you. Because what happened is, one of them was about to ask Jesus a question. Okay? Before I go into that question, let me explain how Jesus answered him so that we all understand. Jesus used what is called a parable. A lot of times I think we get a little confused by the parables. We think that the parables are actually people that happened in the Bible, and what it is, they're not usually, or at all when it's a parable. It's a story meant to illustrate a point. What Jesus would do is he would tell a parable, again, which is a story that would teach you something. So they usually always actually started with something like, there was, or it is like, or something like that, where it would be kind of a trigger in your mind to say, Jesus is about to make up a story that's going to teach me a point about something real. It's kind of like some of us have grandparents and aunts and uncles that kind of would tell stories, and you're kind of scratching your head like, I don't understand. Is there a point to that? And there usually was, and you get to the end of the story and it'd be like, oh my gosh, I get it. Jesus would use these, and that's anytime you hear the word parable, you're hearing them speaking of a story that's told to make a point. He would use realistic illustrations, but they wouldn't be real live breathing people. And so the story I'm about to tell you isn't real live breathing people. However, the lawyer that asked the questions is, and Jesus is as well. And so let's read the first part of this passage. It's the story of the Good Samaritan. And again, 72 people have come back. The religious leaders have gathered around to catch Jesus. And the one that is brave enough to steps forward and asks this. On one occasion, an expert in the law, meaning someone who knew everything about church stuff, stood up to test Jesus. Teacher, he asked, what must I do to inherit eternal life? What is written in the law, he replied. How do you read it? And that's Jesus' answer back. I love how Jesus would do that. If you asked a question of Jesus, he would always ask you a question back. That had to be the scariest moment in this guy's life because he had seen all of his friends get just lambasted when that question gets asked back. Because it's actually, you're trying to get Jesus and he turns it right back on you. I don't know, you tell me. That's kind of scary. Any children ever been in a situation with your parents and they ask you a question after you ask them a question and you know you're about to be in trouble? It happens in our house all the time. My son will come up with something like, I don't know, why did you do that? And that's a scary moment on his face because he doesn't have any answer at all. Because I'm 11 is usually the answer we get. But that was what Jesus would do. So it goes on like this. Jesus' answer, or the lawyer's answer, sorry. He answered, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, with all your strength and with all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. Jesus looks at him, you've answered correctly. Do you do this and you will live? But he wanted to justify himself, so he asked Jesus another question, and who is my neighbor? And in this really quick interaction that sets up the story of the Good Samaritan, we see a lot of important information that's important for all Christians to believe. Before I go any further, I just want to make a really, really important point. If you're in this room and you are a Christ follower, this is going to make a little bit more sense to you than if you're in this room and you're not. So I just want to say before we go, if you're here today and you don't have a relationship with Jesus, I want to encourage you to understand the first part of that answer, that loving the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your mind, with all your soul, and with all your strength is having a relationship with Jesus that is eternal. It's accepting the great gift that God gives that allows us to enter into eternity with him. It's saying to him, I want to enter into covenant relationship with you by repentance and baptism and say, I am yours. And that is an important piece of understanding all of what's about to happen. You see, whenever Jesus would tell a parable, those that knew him the most, even though they were still a little puzzled, would understand it a little better. And so if you have never made that decision, I would ask you, even today as you're sitting here, be asking him why. Saying, God, make yourself real enough to me that I can enter into that relationship with you and understand all that follows in this passage. Because it's super critical and it's really important. Now, for those of us that do understand and do know Jesus and walk with him, I think that we've really got to understand some of the nuts and bolts in here to understand that the second part of the answer is as important as the first. Because you see, this was a religious man, right? This is the guy that went to church every week. This is the guy that, like me, posted on social media, was at church on Sunday morning. And he had all of the head knowledge that you could possibly have. He knew the Old Testament probably front and back. He could pull out any scroll at any time and tell you what was on it. He had it all right here. He knew the laws. He was probably sacrificing animals every other day because if you didn't know, there was a lot of blood at this time because they were just killing stuff to try to get right with God because God had told him to do it. And he knew when to do it and how to do it. So he was a church guy. And that was cool. And Jesus kind of affirmed him a little bit and said, yes, you are correct. That's great. I love that you understand that you're supposed to love me with everything you have. But Jesus pointed this out. But you're messing up part of it. And he's about to show him that with this parable of the Good Samaritan. Because what we learn is this: real faith in Christ values people the way God values them, and shows compassion to those who are in need around us. What that basically means is to have this head knowledge is fantastic and wonderful, but if it does not play out in actions towards people around you, do you really have a relationship with Jesus, or do you just know a lot about him? And it's critical that you answer that question for yourself. I grew up in a quote-unquote religious home where I could quote a lot of things about the religion that we were a part of, but I had no idea who Jesus was. Not a clue. I knew what I was supposed to do to make it look like I knew what I was doing. I believe that this guy was in the same boat and really knew what he was supposed to do, but didn't know why or how. And so one of the things I want to do before we go any further, because I'm going to say this word a lot, is compassion. Basically, what we're supposed to do is we're supposed to love the Lord our God with our heart, mind, soul, strength, and we're to love our neighbor as ourselves, which means we're supposed to have compassion on them. Okay? So you're going to hear me say that word. For those of you that don't know what compassion is caring for, and it says on there, wanting to help others. What I would change that slide to if I had a chance to go back, and I'm going to change it, is this: caring for and actually helping others. Wanting to help others is great, but what if you want to do something and you don't do it? Let me give you a for instance. I don't want to eat ice cream every time it's in front of me. I eat ice cream every time it's available because I love it. I don't want to eat it every time, and there's tremendous shame at the end of the ice cream most of the time, but it's delightful when I'm doing it. It's not enough that I want to stop eating ice cream. I have to stop eating ice cream. You see, it's not enough to want to love your neighbor. You have to actually go love your neighbor. And that's the part where the room typically gets a little silent and gets a little scarier, kind of like, but I want to, but I'm not, because we have to actually do it. And that's the point he's about to make with the parable of the Good Samaritan, is it's not enough to want to do this. Another side note really fast is I love that it says this, and we miss it every time, at least I do. It says, and love your neighbor as yourself. I think we're too afraid to love who we are in Jesus as Christians. Do you know that you can only love someone with the quality of love that you give yourself? And I'm not talking about what the world says about loving yourself in a pompous, arrogant way that holds you up above other people. I'm talking about loving yourself as your identity in Jesus. I can love people only when I understand how loved I am. And I believe it's intentional that it says, and love your neighbor as yourself. Because we forget so often that what we have to do is not love ourselves, again, egocentrically, but love ourselves with Christ in the center and being like, no, I am valuable because I'm his. And I think when we get that, I think we begin to be able to love others properly. I think it's really critical to understand that and to not get too caught up in it, but to not just breeze by it and ignore it, but to understand if I'm going to love others, I better love who I am in Jesus and understand who that is. So the parable of the Good Samaritan, we're going to read it in a second, but here's a couple things that it teaches us. Compassion comes from our relationship with God, right? Love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength. So you got to love God first. You can't have real compassion until you do that. Just like Christ had compassion on you, and just like God has compassion on you by sending Christ, you're able to bring that out and send it and share it with others. It also teaches us that compassion should be directed at everyone. You notice how the guy asked the question, but who is my neighbor? I think what he was trying to do there was something kind of tricky, and he ended up making two mistakes in the process. So here's this religious guy, this lawyer, this guy that understood, think of him almost as a headmaster of the religious school. He knew everything there was to know. And the two mistakes he made were, number one, thinking he was actually obeying the first commandment. By having all of it in his head, he thought he was doing it right. He was missing that there is a heart component to loving God. That there is this thing about taking it from here and transferring it to here, and there's all kinds of cliche illustrations about that. But think about the people that you love in your life. Do you just think you love them, or do you feel like you love them? Oftentimes, I feel like I love people. How about you? Do you feel like you love people sometimes? Sometimes I know it's hard to feel that you love someone because you might be angry with them. You might be ticked off. But the reality is, love is here and here. It's really important to understand that, because this guy had all the head knowledge and none of the heart knowledge about Jesus in this illustration. Believing he could love God without loving his neighbor is the second one. It flows right out of the first. He really believed that he could love God without loving what God created, which were the people around him. He thought, I'm obeying the law, I'm doing these things. He was probably a pretty judgmental person. Anybody ever met somebody that's judgmental? They judge everything. I mean everything you do. There's nothing wrong with pointing out the sin or error in a fellow believer, but judging the way some people do is not okay. In that way that it assumes the worst, that goes after people. That's what this guy was very likely like. Just like the rest of the Sadducees and Pharisees, he had this very judgmental, I am more religious than you are attitude. And so Jesus did what Jesus loved to do. And what he did is he gave him a parable. And in this parable, I want you to see this before we even read it. The third thing, compassion responds to need, not perceived value or worth. Remember that as I read this story. Remember all three of those things as I read this for you. So in reply, Jesus said, a man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho when he was attacked by robbers. They stripped him of his clothes, beat him, and went away, leaving him half dead. A priest happened to be going down the same road, and when he saw the man, he passed by on the other side. So too a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him pass by on the other side. But a Samaritan, as he traveled, came where the man was, and when he saw him, he took pity on him. When he saw him, he took pity on him. Had compassion, he cared. The religious folks had walked right by. And here comes the Samaritan. just a regular, normal guy walking down the road. Remember, in an illustration, Jesus is using real imagery to make a point. And there's 3 points of view in this story that I think are important for us to catch, because I think they're the things that we struggle with in our day-to-day life. If you're anything like me, you do at least. First, there's the obvious one. There's the thieves. What do you think? Their mentality was really simple. What's yours is mine. I'm going to go take it from you. If you've got it, I want it. Give it to me. You know, there's a lot of thieves alive today. And I don't just mean the thieves that break into houses and cars and take your stuff. Those people exist too. Are the ones that stand in wait to jump on you and to do literally what's told about in this story. But there's thieves. You know what I think are thieves? Bullies. I think bullies are thieves. People who decide to take away somebody's identity and label them and tear them down. That's the same kind of thief that I think Jesus was referring to here. Now, yes, he's telling the story in a context where you would walk from one place to another and there'd be actual people that would come and beat you. But I think in today's day and age, there are people that steal people's identity, and they try to make them feel less than who they are. There are thieves that take our time. There are thieves that do all kinds of things. And I think there's thieves that aren't even people. I think there's thieves that are electronic, to take away from what we can do and what we can learn, because we just spend our time glaring at them all the time. Guilty as charged, by the way, so please don't hear judgment in that. But there's thieves. What's yours is mine. Then there's another group, and they're the religious people we talked about, the Levites and the priests. For those of you that don't know, Levites and priests were people in pretty high positions. Priests were folks that could literally have just some direct access with God. And Levites were the entire tribe of Israel that were responsible for carrying forward the law and carrying forward the truth about who God was. And they chose to do exactly something as awful as what the thieves did. Here's a guy, pretend this is the guy, and they're walking down the road, and here's this man bleeding, probably moaning, and this is the religious guy, the church people. And they go like this. Don't make eye contact. Don't look. Hope he doesn't see me. What's mine is their attitude. What's mine belongs to me. Don't bother me with your thing. I got my own, I got me here. And that includes their faith, I think. If they truly understood God, there's no way they would have walked by that man. And Jesus knew that when he used that as an illustration, when he put them in the story that way, as he shared it. He knew that they should have known better. We should know better. We're the church, right? We're the religious people. We've got to know better. Because what's ours is Jesus and the Spirit's work in our life that we can then hand over to others by sharing the gospel with them. They had a chance to share God, and they walked right by this guy and ignored him in this story. Isn't that sad? One of the things that I'm more and more challenged by is we want to reach all of these new people that are coming in. Right? There's a lot of development happening around us, isn't it? Isn't there? There's going to be a lot of new neighbors soon. That's kind of cool, isn't it? We want to reach those new neighbors, don't we? Who wants to reach the new neighbors? Awesome. All right. Who's doing stuff to reach their neighbors right now? Awesome. Less hands, though. Can I tell you something? If we're not reaching our neighbors right now, we're not going to reach the neighbors that aren't here yet. I think the story of the Good Samaritan should be a reminder of that to us. We got to reach the people that are standing next to us today. It doesn't matter if 25,000 people moving down the street next Tuesday. We're not going to reach a single one of them if we're not reaching the people already around us. That's what his answer to the lawyer was. Hey, stop being mine is mine here. Cut it out. What you've got is a relationship with God that you can share with others. You can meet their needs. You can do something for them. You can make a difference. Because then we get to the Samaritan, and the Samaritan's mentality was what ours must be, and the lawyer should have been, and it's this: what's mine is yours. I will do anything I can to serve you. I will give you the things that I have off my back. I will give you the faith that I have by living it out and showing you who Jesus really is, by loving you no matter what, by caring for you no matter what, by not deciding whether or not you're worth me caring for you, because the very fact that you're alive means you're worth caring for. That's an amazing thing, isn't it? To just care for people because they were created by God. That's really what we should be doing. That's what Jesus is saying. And the Samaritan in this story did that. Cared deeply enough. Didn't go walking by the guy, said, "Oh my gosh, let me help you." Got right down and began to meet the needs. Began to do things that mattered. Because what we have to understand, as I've already said, is it's not perceived value, it's the fact that they have value. One of the cool things I've had a chance to see this summer on our 3 mission trips with our students is to watch them just care for people because they're in front of them. And it's kind of easy to do that when you're on an intentional mission trip. I get that. But they've just gone above and beyond. I've watched everyone from 7th graders all the way up to folks that graduated this year care about people that no one cares about. Walk into tent cities in St. Paul and walk up to tents that stink and reek and smell and got cigarette butts all around them and not even make one single judgment on that and kind of say, hey, can I give you something to eat? And hand them food. Walking in a small town in Oregon and just walking up to kids who have got all kinds of stuff and saying, hey, you matter. Let me do something to show that to you. What's mine is yours. My time, my valuables. You'll see some of that in a minute. As we just got back from the Nez Perce Reservation, watching our young 7th graders going into 8th graders literally paint crosswalks with rollers because they hadn't been painted in a long time, and having people in the tribe coming by and going, thank you. We couldn't even see half of these things. We were providing safety. We were meeting needs. They weren't making a judgment about why don't they paint their own stinking crosswalks. Let's paint the crosswalks and love it on people where they were. What's mine is yours. You see, we have this thing in the church in America, especially where we think our faith is private. Let me clarify something. Your faith is not private, okay? It's personal, but it is not private. Your faith should be known by everyone, just like the Samaritan in this story. His faith shows itself magnificently in this next passage. It shows exactly what he did, exactly what we must do if we want people to find Jesus, whether we're 5 or 105. We've got to have the attitude that the Samaritan in this story had, which is this. See, remember, he had already taken pity on him, and here's what he did. He went to him and bandaged his wounds. Can you imagine the blood? He's down near the blood, pouring on oil and wine. Then he put the man on his own donkey, brought him to an inn, and took care of him. The next day, he took out 2 denarii and gave them to the innkeeper. Look after him, he said, and when I return, I will reimburse you for any extra expense you may have. So then Jesus asks, which of these 3 do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of the robbers? The expert in the law replied, the one who had mercy on him. Jesus told him, go and do likewise. And right there we see the gospel lived out in a made-up story about a very real group of people that many people would have second-guessed as the bad guy in the story the minute Jesus mentioned them. Because here's what we learn. Compassion always costs us something. Every single time. Compassion will cost you. And that's what we're not willing to do so often, is have it cost us anything. We're so caught up sometimes in the mine is mine, and sometimes even in the what's yours is mine, that we don't live out the what's mine is yours. We don't live it out because we're not willing to take risks. You see, it's going to cost you risk. Do you think there might have been a little risk walking across a set of train tracks and following a couple of missionaries down into a tent city where around any corner could be homeless people and trying to figure out how to find them and walk up to their tent? There's a little risk in that, isn't there? I mean, it's calculated risk. It's not just reckless. It's calculated. It's are we going to find anyone? Are we going to walk up? Are they going to be violent? Are they going to be on drugs? Are they going to be any of this stuff, you know? And the great thing was having a few people that do that day in and day out with us who have a relationship with all these guys. And so they led the way, and then they'd introduce us to the folks. And it was amazing to watch. But it was risky. Taking a mission trip over the summer, whether you're a student or an adult, that's risky. Anytime you get in the van and drive on I-5, whew. I mean, that's bad. I mean, this new law is great, but when are they going to stop? One day, I'm driving down I-5. Okay, side note. And there's a guy shaving, and I don't mean an electrical shaver. He had shaving cream on his face. And he's going like this. I kind of wanted to honk the horn and startle him, but I decided I also didn't want to. But, you know, I mean, it's risky, right? Loving people is risky. It really is, because it's going to cost you something. It can be a risk that all of a sudden your heart's out there, and somebody might reject it, and you feel hurt. You might stand up to the bully and get bullied. There's a risk in it. There was a risk to stop. You know, the robbers might still be nearby. And he's down there on his knees bandaging a wound. He could have been the next guy. But he took a risk. Having compassion is risky. Are we willing to take it? The other thing that having compassion requires is crossing social barriers. I love that Jesus used a Samaritan here. Some of you are very familiar with why that would be important, but let me explain it to those of you that don't. The Samaritans were not looked upon favorably by the Jewish people. They were called names. They were considered to be less than they were. They were considered to be people not worth your time. And yet Jesus uses them in this example. We see Jesus in Samaria sitting by a well. We see Jesus constantly breaking through that social barrier. Having compassion means stepping across. For you kids in the room, it means sitting at the lunch table with the person that everybody picks on all the time and not picking on them and even standing up for them and saying, no, we're not going to do that here. I call on the name, Jesus is my God. I'm not going to let you do that. That's risky too, back to the risk. But it's stepping across. It's looking at the person that might have even done the most wrong to you and saying, no, I'm going to do the best I can for you because I want you to know Jesus and you have a need. It's walking up to a homeless person and realizing, they're the outcasts of our society. I would argue that the homeless are the lepers of today. And Jesus spent a lot of time taking care of lepers. Not leopards, by the way. I don't want any kids running out going, Pastor Rob said we need to go to the zoo and pet the leopards. Don't do that. It's lepers. And I say that because one time I was singing a song when I first became a Christian, and he heals the leper's spots. I thought it was leopard spots, and I thought the spots were fine. I didn't understand it, but now I get it. So now I know he's healing. He's healing a condition, an outcast problem. That's what the homeless of our day are, I believe, along with some of the other issues that folks struggle with. I'll never forget the first time I was in Chicago that I walked up to a homeless person and I looked them in the eye, not knowing that I was doing anything out of the ordinary. I had a sandwich for him, and I looked him in the eye and I put my hand on his shoulder and he just dropped to the ground weeping. And I'm like, what'd I do? And after he got himself together and he stood back up and we're talking about life, he told me about his family and he said, do you know why I cried? And I said, no, I have no idea. And he goes, you're the first person to touch me in a non-angry way in 6 years. He'd been beaten up. He'd been accosted. He'd been arrested. But he'd never had anyone just do this. How you doing? And just tap his shoulder in an affectionate way. What if we did that with our neighbors around us? What if we showed them compassion and love? What if we took care of those that are nearby? What if we reached across the barriers? What if we did sit at the lunch table with the kid that no one wants to sit with and did it intentionally, not to make them a project, but to make them a person again, to love them? What if at work we stopped being a part of the gang-up crowd that happens sometimes even in the adult world and begin to say, no, I got his back. I got her back. Without any judgment, without anything, just love. That's what the Samaritan was meant to teach us in this parable. And then it's the last one. Goes with both of the two. You got to be willing to pay the price. You got to be willing to pay what it's going to take. Sometimes that will literally be your money. I do not recommend handing money to a homeless person on the street. However, there's occasions where God might put that in your heart. I think that you got to be super careful about that. However, I do think that you can put food in their stomach. You can put your hand on their shoulder and make them feel like a human being again. You can do something as simple as looking them in the eye and not looking away. You can do that with the kid at school that you know is bullied all the time and just maybe for the first time make them feel like they've got an ally standing at their back. The person at work that's feeling dejected and maybe down, and you just look them in the eye and say, it's going to be okay. That's what neighbors do. See, because your neighbor I'm going to answer the question for you. You might know the answer. The neighbor is everyone you come in contact with every single day. That's your neighbor. Some of them happen to share addresses just down the street from your house. But if you're on the bus and there's a person next to you, that's your neighbor. If you see a homeless person on the side of the road, that's your neighbor. If you're in the grocery store in line and the checker's standing in front of you checking out, there's your neighbor. So the answer to the question is simple. They're all your neighbor. And if you really, truly love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength, you're going to absolutely love your neighbor enough to try to share Jesus with them through your actions and your words. But I am more and more convinced that the actions must come first. We've got enough people screaming at people biblical truth. It is biblical, it's valid, it's true. But when we scream it, and when we yell about it, and when we don't do that in the context of a relationship, would you respond to that? I bet you wouldn't. But yet that's sometimes our first instinct is to tell people how bad and wicked they are. And they need to be told about sin. Please don't mishear me. I am not saying that we sugarcoat stuff. We be honest. We tell the truth. But we do it within the context of, you know what, I love you. Have you ever considered this? What if somebody rejects the message of Jesus that you give them? Are you supposed to throw them away, or are you supposed to continue to love them? I think regardless of how they respond, you keep loving them, no matter what. There are sinful people in the world, right? As a church, let's stop acting like that they already know better. Let's just love them. Let's just love each other so that we can then love them and we can love God. So here's your challenge. And if you've got your bulletin, please take it and please jot this down. I gave this challenge to others. I just want you to think about this. This is an assignment, because if you're anything like me, you're going to walk out of here today and you might go, yeah, cool. And then tomorrow morning's Monday morning and it's all gone. Unless you do what I'm about to ask you to do. You're more likely to actually follow through if you do this. Write down in your bulletin on a sheet of paper, whatever you do, who your neighbor is. Identify some people that you're going to come in contact with between now and next week, and write their name down. If you don't know their name, write the guy on the corner that's always there looking for food. Whatever it is that you feel. Who's your neighbor? The friend down the street that nobody ever knocks on their door when the kids are getting together to go play. That might be your neighbor. But write it down. It might be your physical neighbor. Just write their names. Before you leave this property today, at least have 2 or 3 names, or at least be willing to search for them in your mind and your heart this afternoon. And then, this is the hard part. And then write down what you're going to do for those people this week. Something you're really actually going to go do. Pray for them is amazing and awesome, but I want to challenge you to go beyond that. I want you to pray for them, but I also want you to do something for them. I want you to actually have a plan of action. What am I going to do for that person? It might not materialize because the opportunity might not present itself, but don't be the reason it doesn't materialize. Go try to make it happen. It could be something as simple as saying to the barista in Starbucks that you've identified, hey, thanks for the service you give me all the time. And look for a conversation. But go love your neighbor. Because like I've already said, we got some neighbors coming to live nearby soon, and we haven't reached all the neighbors we've already got. And we've got to become really intentional about that. Because Jesus said so. Not because some pastor on stage said so, because Jesus said so. Go love your neighbor as yourself. It's a really simple but hard challenge, isn't it? So there's your homework. If half the people in this room did that, there'll be change in our community this week. I really believe that. If a quarter of you did it, there'll be change. But if more of us do it, there'll be tons of change. And people will have a chance to see Jesus lived out in front of them through the lives of the people that walked in this church this morning. We're going to transition, but still stay on the same theme. Loving the Lord our God with all our heart, mind, soul, and strength is the first step. But loving our neighbor as ourselves has got to have a plan, like I just said. So if we could get the ushers to come forward, get ready to take the offering. This week, we had a chance to love our neighbors through our High Power Sports Camp. It was a pretty awesome week. How many of you were part of High Power Sports Camp this week? Raise your hands. Adults, kids alike. Pretty awesome. We had 140 young people in this building, sitting right where you were, right here in the front. Basketball hoops were out. Soccer, people played soccer out there. Little kids were jumping around being crazy. I watched as some of our young teens just led them. Some of our adults led them. We had cheerleaders doing cheer stuff. I won't do that for you because it'll scare you. But it was awesome because in the context of all of that, they were told about being brave and about loving Jesus. And 6 kids, gave some kind of a response to the gospel that was presented this week. That's pretty awesome. We should clap for that. And this week, we'll be following up with them, and I'm sure some of them probably made that final step to Jesus. Some of them maybe made that first step for the first time, saying, okay, I'm going to figure out this Jesus thing, but I'm pretty sure we'll start to see some kids being baptized because of what happened this past week. Like I said, it was about 136 to 140 kids. We had 50 on-the-ground volunteers, closer to probably 75 to 100 people contributing to everything that happened. So this congregation loved this week. And loved a bunch of kids. I want to tell you the story of my neighbor real quick. I'm hoping someday to tell this story about my neighbor and be embarrassed to have him walk up to me and kind of say, I'm here today. because for 4 years we've been praying for this neighbor that we love and we do life with, and we were able to do sports camp this week, and for the first time we got their daughter to come on our campus, which means they came on our campus. She got to hear the gospel this week, and she hasn't responded to it yet that I'm aware of, but I can tell you what happened when I got back here on Friday from our mission trip, and I'm sitting in the back corner, and she comes by, and I said, "Hey, Kaylee," and she comes running over, and she grabs me, she gives me a big hug, and I was just like, oh my gosh, I just got to hug her right here. This little girl we've been praying for 4 years, I just got to hug her on our campus where she was hearing the gospel. Isn't that awesome? And she told me when we got home that night, she looked at me and she goes, "I'm so glad I went to camp. It was the best time I've ever had." And then she told me one of the Bible stories. You see, when we give, we're loving our neighbor. When we give our time, when we give our talent, when we open the doors and we say, "Come on in," and when we reach out to our neighbors for 4 years sometimes, God bears fruit in that in his timing. So as the ushers come forward, I want you to keep in mind that as we give, and we are such a generous church, just know that that goes to loving the neighbors around us. That goes to putting on a sports camp where 140 kids can come and hear the gospel, and families can hang out with the sports camp people and get to know them. So I'm going to pray for this. Dear Lord, thank you so much for your amazing faithfulness. Thank you for the folks in this room that can change the world, Lord, just by loving you first and then loving their neighbor. God, I pray that we would take that call serious, Lord, that we would go forward. Lord, we would use these resources to continue to look for creative ways to love on our neighbors. Lord, I thank you for the generosity that allows us to continue to plug forward and do the gospel things that we get to do and see the kingdom advance. So Lord, use this, Lord, not for human gain, but for the gain of your kingdom. In Christ's name. Amen. And finally, as we get ready to wrap up, it's my privilege to introduce you to a group of people today. Like I said, that sports camp happened last week because of a lot of people that worked hard. And some of the people that worked hard are part of a new team that we formed here at Lake Sawyer. I know some people have been a little confused as I've been talking to myself and introducing myself as the family pastor. It's because that's what I am now. I'm still the youth pastor. Some folks, "You're not the youth pastor." Yes, I'm still doing youth. I'm still doing that. I love doing that. But back in June, I stepped into a role of family pastor. Something that I'm familiar with. I did it for 13 years at my old church, where I did a lot of preaching, and I also oversaw the children in the youth ministry with a really cool teams of volunteers, and just a privilege and an honor to see God use that gifting. But really for me, what's the highlight of it all is some ladies we're going to put up on the screen right here. Over the past 2 months, I've been building a team or working with one team member that was already in place to say, hey, how do we best reach our young people? How do we reach our neighbors? As these folks come in, how do we do better? How do we make this work? So what we've done is we've structured our family ministry to include youth ministry and children, and I get the privilege of pastoring those areas and shepherding and caring for those people and leading those teams, and I want to introduce you to them. I won't make them stand up because I think I got kicked last time for making them stand up. So most of them are in the room. I want to introduce you to Charlene Sinclair. She's been in our nursery toddler area for over a year, actually. She was already in place, and she works really hard on Sunday mornings to make sure that we have a tremendous ministry for our youngest kids. And let me tell you, 25 years of being involved in some way in children and youth, she's one of the best, if not the best, nursery toddler coordinator I've ever seen. She loves our kids and she loves her team. And those of you that serve with her have gotten to see that, and she just bangs it out of the park every week. Alicia Bilton is our preschool and kindergarten coordinator, which means she takes care of everything in Portable 1 over there. So she takes care of making sure that all of our next level up kids have got great teaching, great teachers, great training, great everything so that they can be successful, and we can see our kids really, really nurtured in the gospel. She also is our administrative assistant, so she's doing some administrative work, helping oversee check-in and doing some of those things, and just banging it. And actually, I am going to embarrass her, because if it wasn't for her, last week would have been about half as good as it was. Alicia just banged it out last week. Yeah, clap for her, because she worked really hard. Everyone else did too, believe me. But I'll tell you, every night when I was over in Lapwai, I was doing texting back and forth, or at least chatting with her. Hey, how you doing? How's it feel? You know, kind of update the things that you do when you have the privilege of being in their lives, and hearing the great reports and knowing how much work she put into that, along with this entire team and so many others in the room. But just thank you, Alicia, for that. And then Terry is our recent addition. Terry has been out in our children's ministry for over a year, and in essence has already been leading in so many ways. And so it was a no-brainer when we had that conversation to say, hey, Terry, would you come and help coordinate this Sunday morning thing for elementary? So she handles our first through sixth grade. And what's really amazing and awesome about it is they're all working within their passion, and they're all completely dedicated to that one specific area, making it great. And that's so cool, because that's really good news for your kids and the kids that come in the door, because they are all in. I get to say that my job is to equip, empower, and encourage, and to just gather them together and learn from them while they hopefully learn from me along the way. I think we're on the very precipice of the best things we've ever seen here. I've heard Aaron say it, I've heard other elders say it. Our best days are ahead, and I think this is part of our best days. Being able to see our children just poured into and dedicated people just loving on each group of children. Well, I get to continue to work with the amazing youth staff and do incredible stuff with our youth as the fall launches and things like that. So I just want to encourage you and let you know that God is at work. And there may be some changes, and there may be some things that look different, but guess who didn't change at all? Jesus. Didn't change one bit. He's the same. And we're going to reach our neighbors. Amen? We're going to reach our neighbors. And let's go get them. So I'm going to have you stand up. I'm going to pray for you. If you're new, please come to the Connection Zone. We'd love to say hi. Stop back at the first steps. And if you are wearing a red shirt and you attended High Power Sports Camp, we intentionally saved this announcement to last, because once I make it, they're going to want to run. You cannot run until I pray. You may go back to the corners and get your promised candy bar for wearing your High Power Sports Camp shirt. There's a very specific reason we did not give those out ahead of time, because my daughter, I wish I'd gotten a picture of her in between services. The chocolate melts fast in the heat. And my daughter walked back in, there was just chocolate. And what we didn't want is we didn't want the chocolate of the child behind you on you. So we decided the chocolate would be handed out at the end. So make sure you grab your chocolate bar. You got to have a red shirt on to get it. And go reach your neighbors with the message and the gospel of Jesus Christ this week. So let me pray for you. Dear Lord, thank you for each person in this room. Lord, thank you for the fact that, Lord, you are indeed God, and that you are at work in our lives, and at work in this body, and at work in this region. Lord, we pray that we would be able to love our neighbors as ourselves, that we would love you first and love you deeply. God, we just trust that you have got so much in store for us, because you're unchanging and unchangeable. Lord, use us to change the people around us. In Jesus' name, amen. Have a great week.